Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Stacy Schiff, the author of The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams. She's written 6 books and is a Pulitzer Prize winner. It is our honor to be joined by the great Stacy Schiff. Thanks so much for being here.
I'm delighted to join you, Evan.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. The relationship between how much we know collectively about Samuel Adams versus how often we hear his name is inverse. If you Google him, the first result sends you to the beer brand. And there's nothing on the front page of that website that's actually about him, the person, the man. Indeed, we do find out from her book that he was a maltster, and I hope I'm saying that right, a maltster. Well, Stacy Schiff says none other than Thomas Jefferson himself said Samuel Adams was truly the man of the Revolution. Stacy writes early on in this book, and by the way, this book was on Barack Obama's list of favorites for the year 2022. She says Adams muscled words into deeds, affecting a revolution that culminated with the Declaration of Independence. So, Stacy, to those who want to be persuasive, to have an impact on others, what is the lesson that Samuel Adams leaves behind?
Well, he really is a master communicator. There are many people over these years voicing all kinds of concerns and criticisms of British legislation, what we all know is the Sugar and the Stamp Acts and the Townsend duties. But it is Adams who best articulates first American principles, who's able to sort of spin criticisms of British overreach into real anthems around which people can rally. And he does that tirelessly and with enormous determination over many years, over more than a decade, in fact, but under something like 30 pseudonyms. So he's writing a sort of a one-man multitude. You can sometimes trace him and sometimes not trace him, because I don't think we've, in fact, identified all of those pseudonyms, but he is a kind of one-man media industry.
One person we may feel we know, one reason we may feel we know Samuel Adams is because of his second cousin. The man made more famous probably today because he was a president and because he's been portrayed in various plays and movies that are familiar in our pop culture. Is the relationship with John Adams a distraction to what we need to understand about Samuel Adams, who never became president and is not often at least seen on the Broadway stage or in movies? Or do they have enough in common with one another where that relationship between them, second cousin, is revealing?
I do think there are many reasons why we have forgotten Samuel Adams, or at least why he's gone missing. And I do think the confusion of Adamses plays some role in that. There's a very funny moment when John Adams travels to France during the Revolution to help Benjamin Franklin secure French assistance for the war effort. And everyone assumes he's Samuel Adams. And he keeps saying to people, I'm not that great man. I'm not Samuel Adams. And they think he's just being modest. Because at that time, Samuel Adams is the more eminent Adams, as he will remain for some time. John is the sort of lesser satellite. And that's, I think, important to stress, is that Samuel is the older, is the more sophisticated of the two cousins. They're 13 years apart. And it is Samuel who will recruit John, in fact, to the patriot cause, as he will recruit many other people. And in fact, it's said of Samuel Adams that if for no other reason, he could go down in history as the recruiting agent for the American Revolution, because he pulls John Hancock and John Adams and Josiah Quincy and so many other people into his orbit. But it's from John, who is younger and, as we all know, kind of addicted to the written word, who leaves us the best portraits of his cousin Samuel. And so it's from John that we get the most intimate picture of Samuel Adams, by whom really John is starstruck when first they meet in the early 1760s. I mean, John really looks up to him, not just as an older man, but as, a real leading light in Boston in these years, and a man of just enormous erudition. And as he puts it, sort of genteel humanity and exquisite erudition, I think, are his words.
Before we get to when he became the embodiment of those adjectives, I want to ask about his early life. He was born in Boston in 1722. Massachusetts, of course, was only a colony. And it was well before the conflict with the mother country starts to hit this fever pitch. What do we need to know about colonial America that shaped young Samuel to become a rebel later on in his life?
I think there are a few essentials that it pays us to attend to. One is, and this is truly important, that Boston is in a state of economic decline in these years, that it has all kinds of economic issues, partly because industries are decamping, partly because there's very little hard currency in the colonies, partly because it's losing population to New York and Philadelphia. So you have a town in some economic distress. Adams is born to a very wealthy family which is in itself in decline. He'll be, as I put it, the only downwardly mobile of the founders. So that plays a role as well. And that's something of which his enemies lose sight later. They will all write him off as a man of disappointed ambition, as a kind of desperado, but they lose sight of the fact that he's actually very well born, immensely well educated. He has 2 Harvard degrees. He goes to all the right schools, but then gives himself entirely to thinking about and writing about politics. And so the answer to your question is, over those early years, he really amounts to very little. He gets a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Harvard. He, to some extent, helps to hold on to the family fortune, which he ultimately will squander. He has a very short-lived career in an accounting firm, where it is noted that he's a very capable young man, but can think only about politics and really has no time for his ledgers. He briefly will serve as a tax collector in the town of Boston, where he seems to be more indulgent than effective. And he will ultimately he'll be a market clerk, which was another sort of minor town position in Boston.
The life track that I kept thinking of as I read this book is the track of George W. Bush, who had a second act. I'm not, I don't want to compare too much, but it's someone who had a second act, and he gave up drinking, and he was kind of never, he always kind of struggled professionally, and he, had some businesses that didn't quite work out, some that certainly did. But I just kept thinking it's a similar thing. He made his imprint later in life. Does that comparison resonate with you? Is there another modern comparison that might work?
I think that means that Samuel Adams would have become a painter in his third act, right?
Right.
I'm not sure. It certainly resonates in the sense that you have someone who has a very sort of aimless first act, an immensely effective second act, during which he's really the most wanted man in America. And then really after the revolution amounts to very little. And so I'm not sure that tracks exactly with George Bush. Adams is seen by his enemies as a man of the people. And I think we still think of George Bush as a thorough patrician during every one of his acts, right? I mean, one of the interesting things about Adams is partly because of those less employed, ineffective early decades, he's very much at home with the man in the street. And he's one of the very few people who can connect the educated upper class, so to speak, in Boston with the milliners and the hatters and the innkeepers and the butchers whom he knows from his time as a tax collector.
Religion is important in the story of Samuel Adams. And so I want to ask about that. Whenever I read about religion in the 1700s, certainly the early 1700s, but later too, it does feel a bit like a foreign language to those of us who are, contemporary people, and we all are. Religion has changed so much over the centuries in the way it's practiced and the theories behind it. What do we need to know about the kind of family he was born into, politically, socially, religiously, and how did religion in particular shape him?
Puritanism plays a major role here. He's an immensely pious man, known for his piety. And as was true of the families of Ben Franklin and the other numbers of young pious Bostonians, the expectation was that he would actually enter the ministry, for which he doesn't seem to have any proclivity. But that was certainly the obvious track for someone of his background. And certainly Puritanism translates very quickly into republicanism. I think it's Gordon Wood who calls republicanism just a relaxed secular form of Puritanism. And certainly that sort of community-minded, very egalitarian take on government falls out very much from Adams's religious beliefs. But yes, he's known as he's very central in his own church. He quotes liberally from scripture. He's known to drop religious allegories into his speeches, always very close to his religion. And I think in a way that may account for at the end of his life, one of the reasons why he is out of sync somewhat with the new America that is founded after the Revolution.
Before we get to this famous second act that he takes on as an adult, I want to ask you how you approached this book. At what point did you realize there needed to be a more full story of Samuel Adams told? And then how did you go about doing that? What were your sources for this book?
That's such a great question. I think it fell out of two things more or less simultaneously. My previous book had been about Salem witchcraft, and I had spent 5 or 6 years in a very dark place because of that. And at the end of 1692, at the end of the years of the Salem witch trials, very quietly and very tentatively, a few very courageous people begin to stand up and say anonymously that they think something is amiss, that the trials are perhaps a miscarriage of justice, that there can't possibly be this many witches in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the courage that it took to make that kind of principled stand was something that I was just fascinated by, and it somewhat led me directly to Adams, because it correlates very much to his taking a very unpopular and very sort of out of sync stand later. Adams makes a cameo in my book on Benjamin Franklin, and I had never really thought very much about him, which was mortifying because I am from Adams, Massachusetts, so I might have had some inkling as to who he was. So those two things were on my mind, and I felt that this book was in a funny way the missing link between the benighted years of Salem witchcraft and the Enlightenment years of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. How did we get from one to the other? What was the pivotal piece in between? And I went back to read Adams's contemporaries, and when you do that, you are struck over and over again by their tributes to the fact that he is the man of the hour. Jefferson says as much. John Adams says as much. John Adams will credit him with having essentially created the revolution that preceded the real revolution, the revolution in thinking that preceded the revolution in fighting. Jefferson will say he's the most active, the earliest, the most persevering man of the hour. So it was those kinds of tributes that made me think, wow, this is really fascinating. What is it that they know that we have lost sight of? And that sent me back to, in answer to your question about the archives, the papers of Samuel Adams, which are imperfect because he necessarily destroyed some of them.
I know. I felt so bad for you as I read his practices in burning all of his correspondence.
I mean, is there anything worse, right? I mean, we have this scene from John Adams of Samuel Adams.
Could have saved me something. Put them in a bottle and sent them in the ocean or something.
Feeding his papers to the fire so that none of their Confederates will suffer for his negligence, as he puts it, exactly. But what he doesn't feed to the fire or cut into small strips and litter from his window is in the New York Public Library, which has a great trove of Samuel Adams papers. So that was sort of ground zero for the research for this book. But because when you are fomenting revolution or at least publishing seditious pieces, you don't tend to call attention to yourself or don't tend to write your deeds down on paper, a lot of what we know, a lot of what I discovered was in the British archives, because a lot of the story here is reconstructed from what Crown officials were saying about him and writing back to London. And they're the ones who are saying there is this, disappointed man, this nuisance, this Machiavelli of chaos. If we could only eliminate Samuel Adams, this nuisance, we could entirely quash the opposition effort. And those letters, which are kind of brilliant and very detailed, are all of them either in the Parliamentary Archives in London or in the Public Records Office in Kew.
And did you have to go there, or can you get them online? Yeah.
You can probably get some of them online. You certainly can't get all of them online.
Yeah.
I mean, accounts of the Boston Tea Party, for example, I think are only in those archives.
Did you get to pick up and hold papers that Samuel Adams had held, or were you dealing with copies? And then how does that experience change what you're able to kind of suck out of them to get data for your book?
I don't think I could write a book if I couldn't hold those papers in my hands. So to your question of, are these papers online? Adams's papers in the New York Public Library are digitized, but I don't think I ever looked at the digital editions until I was writing the endnotes for the book, because you just want to see how it's written. You want to see the speed with which it's written. You want to read out the crossed out sections. You want to see what's on the opposite side. Sometimes you can see the stress with which a person is writing. And here I'm thinking of Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor and then the royal governor, where you can see how stressed he is by how often he's editing his own words. He's clearly having trouble. Often when he speaks about Adams, he edits himself greatly. It's really interesting to see. And that's the kind of thing I don't think I would have noticed if I had only read things online. So yes, I just feel like you want to see the envelopes that they came in. You want to see how they're set on the page, and you want to see the things that someone attempted to excise, because of course those are always the most interesting parts.
Your sentences are just quite beautiful. I mean, and if I may say that's truly meant to be a genuine compliment. I mean, the sentences and the way they flow together are really in some ways magical in the way you do them. And I wonder if you subscribe to the Robert Caro theory, which is that great nonfiction can read like fiction. Do you approach it that way, or is it just kind of a natural way for you to do storytelling?
I don't think I would want to read something that wasn't beautifully written. And I feel that way as much about nonfiction as I do about fiction. So my feeling is twofold. Yes, very much of the Robert Caro school. I just saw him actually last night.
And how is he, by the way?
He's writing. You're not allowed to ask. He tried to ask me what my new project was, and I tried to turn it on him by saying, "Have you finished the book yet?" It didn't go so well for me to ask that question. But yes, very much. I mean, the attention to the sentences on the page is just, a lifelong habit of wanting to read good writing. But I admit that if left to my own devices, I am probably reading a novel rather than reading a book of nonfiction, just because that is where the real felicity of language, seems to live much of the time. But my feeling is that you want the reader to turn the page. And in order to ask that of the reader, you need to either create some kind of beauty on the page or some sort of suspense somewhere between the pages. And I suppose that's the elusive object, and you never know if you've accomplished it until someone says something nice, as you just did. So thank you.
No, it's truly wonderful writing. Just to read the writing itself is a lot of fun for me, in addition to the content. Okay, one more question about you before we get back to our hero here. I'm wondering, do you feel pressure as a Pulitzer Prize winner? I mean, it's like saying someone's the Baseball Hall of Famer, right? For the rest of their life, they are the Hall of Famer, Mike Piazza, let's say. Do you feel pressure that every new book has to be great and has to be received with the same critical acclaim as the one that won the big prizes has? Do you feel like you have to deliver, in other words?
I think that the need to deliver is unfortunately it's wired in from the beginning. It doesn't have anything to do with prizes or any kind of external pats on the head, although I like external pats on the head, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Interestingly for me, the book that won the Pulitzer, which was my second book, was a book very few people read. And so for me, the great surprise came with my fourth book, which was Cleopatra, which was the first book of mine that really anybody bought in quantity. So it's almost as if it's a different career, the prize-winning career versus the best-selling career. So I think I feel a certain... I certainly feel a tremendous drive to want to get the sentences right for my own sake, because you want to look your best and sound your best on the page. But I don't think it really has any corresponds in any way to, did I win? Will I win? Do I need to live up to some sort of prize expectation?
Gotcha. All right.
I'm always disappointing myself. It's just a new way every day is the short answer to your question.
Yeah. It's funny how you said, unfortunately, I have ingrained in myself, and I'm like, oh boy,
it's a cross for my family to bear. Yeah.
There you go. At what point do we start? Okay. Back to Samuel Adams here. At what point do we start to see his development of this theory that he has, that people act on their feelings, as you wrote, more strongly than they do reason? Moral people elect moral leaders. How did he come to those two conclusions?
I don't know that we can actually draw a straight line for how he comes to the second one. I think he's just a master psychologist in many ways. And so the first one seems very natural to him. We hear his voice, really, politically speaking, for the first time in the resistance to the Stamp Act. And I don't think he's playing on emotions yet at that point. I think he's simply making a very rational argument with which we are all familiar about the fact that, an island should not be legislating for a continent in which does not feel itself represented in that government. That's a piece of logic that he will express in any number of ways over the years that follow. I think my favorite is when Adams basically says, look, the two governments are entirely identical. They were designed to be identical. So why don't we tax you? Why should it go from your direction? So he's willing to, he's a very good loophole creator and an exploiter of illogic. I just think the feel for people is something which must have been developed early. I think there's a popularity with Adams. You can see this even when you see this later when people are doing things like helping to outfit him in a better wardrobe before he goes to the Continental Congress. You can see a great deal of affection for him. But you see it earlier on when he gets himself into terrible debt as I said, very ineffective tax collector, and a whole cohort of people pony up money to bail him out. So there's clearly just a great deal of credit, a great deal of affection coming his way from colleagues and from people who don't even seem to have known him terribly well.
Yeah. So how does he get drafted into politics? And then the fervor of Massachusetts is also acting upon him at the same time.
So he's has a mentor in a very brilliant lawyer named James Otis, who at this point is pretty much the leading radical, or at least in the minds of the Crown officials, the worst incendiary in town. And it's for Otis that Adams will begin to edit pages. Adams is known as has to have a very agile pen, and he will begin to help draft and redraft pieces for Otis and for other members of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, so that even before Adams is elected to government, even before he's elected to the House, he will help to draft the first salvo against imperial authority, the first response to London against taxation. And it is with that effort that he then is elected himself to government. But it seems to have been for his editorial capacities at first that he's yoked in really to these efforts.
How does he start reacting to the acts, if I may? How does he, what are his responses to the Townshend Acts and the Stamp Acts and the Tea Acts? How do those start to up the ante for him? And how does he begin to go sort of full patriot?
Well, he's very quick to realize that the two things, that the best response is an economic response. And he's very quick to begin to organize boycotts and pickets and any other kind of sort of economic pressure he can put on the Crown in order to rethink some of these policies. I mean, this is a time, and it's important to remember this, where the colonies were very hemmed in by legislation. You couldn't print a Bible in the colonies. You couldn't transport a bolt of wool from one to the other. The joke was that if you wanted to put shoes on a horse, you had to send it to Great Britain to be shod. I mean, there were just a tremendous number of restrictions. And Adams plays with that in the press a great deal in terms of drumming up support for a resistance effort, but he also just tries very hard to press the economic button here, to say we're not going to import, we're not going to buy goods, we're going to begin to weave our own fabrics, we're going to be able to spin our own yarn. And he's very insistent on that. But much more importantly, for the long run, he will from the very beginning attempt to pull the colonies together. And he's not terribly successful in those efforts until 1772, really, with the Committees of Correspondence. But very early on, and long before I think the question of independence is anywhere on the table, he's aware of the fact that the colonies really need to hold together, that only as uniting their voices are they going to make themselves heard in the corridors of power.
Who became his allies of the day? Whose sort of approach to government whose approach to government resonated with him, and what alliances did he start to build among those who were also helping to lead the colonies?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Initially, he is very close, recruits as well, I should say, John Hancock, who's immensely important because he has a tremendous fortune which he can in some way enlist in the cause. He's very close with Dr. James Warren, who's the doctor who dispatches Paul Revere in April of 1775. And he's very close, as I said, to Otis and to John Adams, who does a lot of legal work over these years in terms of helping to draft legislation and responses to Great Britain. He'll slowly begin to reach out to other colonies, largely for the reason that he knows Massachusetts men and Bostonians in particular have a reputation as sort of hot-headed fanatics. And so he will very often sort of reach out to people in South Carolina, people in Rhode Island to say, you have better reputations than we do. Why don't you try to put this idea forward? There's some correspondence with Dickinson in Pennsylvania. But a lot of that is an attempt to sort of say, look, we're on the same page here, but this would be better coming from you than coming from me. So there are these kind of early kind of one-off attempts to create some sort of intercolonial cooperation.
What did he think of George Washington?
We have very little about the two. Adams is for a very long period of time on the committees in Congress that correspond with Washington. He's sort of overseeing the correspondence. With very little sense of how the two relate. It will be said of Adams, Adams has the misfortune of living long enough to read the first histories of the American Revolution. And when, of course, he reads those histories, he discovers events that never happened. And one event that he will discover in the first history of the Revolution is that he is a party to the Conway Cabal, which was a crazy plan to unseat George Washington, in which he was never involved. So, we have this imputation on the record, but it's false. There's a moment when George Washington comes back to Boston after the war, and is walked around town by John Adams and Samuel Adams. And John Adams makes a great deal of this moment as a sort of a moment for the portraitists, a moment for the ages, because you have this very tall Virginian between these two, squat Bostonians, basically. So there seems to have been a certain amount of warmth, certainly of recognition for Adams's early role, but very little sense of the relationship itself.
And Thomas Jefferson, obviously John Adams famously had a political rivalry with him. Clearly, Jefferson had strong feelings while he was alive for Samuel Adams. What about going the other way?
I think in terms of their thinking and their political philosophies, Jefferson and Adams align most neatly. And I think the best thing to cite is the letter Thomas Jefferson, after his first inaugural address, will write to Adams, a very, very touching letter in which he says, I hope you heard that address as it was intended. It was essentially a private letter to you. And behind those honeyed words, this is Jefferson after power has been handed off from one political party to the other for the first time in American history, trying to unite the country. And Jefferson writes to Adams, I was thinking about you. I was wondering, is this how Samuel Adams would have said this? He refers to Adams as the sort of apostle of liberty and says to him, your principles have been tried in the crucible of time, and they have come out pure. It's an immensely touching letter. And I think it speaks very much to the warmth of the relationship. But I think both men were of that feeling that government should be kept small and that the man in the street should be heard.
Notice I keep saying Samuel, because I think you wrote in the book that, you did, that Samuel is sort of what he was called in polite company, and Sam was kind of a derogatory way of referring to him. How did that happen? And we clearly today almost always say Sam Adams because we're often talking about the beer, which we'll get to, by the way. But Sam versus Samuel here.
I think, Evan, thank you for picking up on that. I think it takes a little bit of work to get back to Samuel when you're used to Sam.
Yeah, it does.
I can't exactly put my finger on when he's reduced to Sam. People clearly address him as Samuel. All letters are addressed to him as Samuel. He signs himself Samuel, but misleadingly, and including on the Declaration of Independence, when he signs Samuel, it's very often SAM with a little period and then a tiny little L, which is meant to represent the three missing syllables. And it's the same way if your name were George, you would have signed GEO and then a dot, as George Washington, may have. So that I think is part of where the misunderstanding about the name comes in. But then when you begin to hear 19th century detractors dismissing Samuel Adams, he's always written off as, oh, Sam Adams, that hothead, or oh, Sam Adams, that fanatic. So I think that's when he loses his additional syllables.
Why are there so many different opinions on his roles in the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party? I don't know if you need to go through the details of his relationships with each one of them. Clearly he was very involved in the Boston Tea Party, but there are also these accusations that he helped spur the Boston Massacre. How did the wide variety of opinions on his role in each happen?
I think part of the answer to your question is that he's always so cleverly behind the scenes that he could be construed as doing any number of things that he probably didn't do. Also, to your point, he's very often credited in the letters that go back to London, in those letters from Crown officials, with articles he didn't write and with deeds in which he was in no way complicit, just because he's known to be such an instigator. In terms of the massacre, for example, he has no role, obviously, in making that happen. He has no role in soldiers firing on civilians that night, but he has every role in the events that follow. And I mean, for example, the moment the next morning when he stands up to Thomas Hutchinson and in front of the governor's council insists that Hutchinson remove the soldiers from Boston because there will not be peace in town until he's done so, a request that takes, in fact, 2 visits. And a request that is immortalized in the John Singleton Copley portrait of Adams. That's Adams in his finest hour. That's Adams standing up to imperial power and essentially saying, you may have your orders, and your commander-in-chief, the commander-in-chief of the forces may be in New York, but you must make those soldiers leave Boston. And he wins that round, much to Thomas Hutchinson's immense dismay. So, that's Adams at his finest, as is what he does in exploiting the Boston Massacre. He tries very hard to make sure that the trials of the soldiers take place very quickly while tempers are still flaring in town. That battle he will lose. Thomas Hutchinson will manage to delay the trials until the fall. But then after the trials and after all but 2 of the soldiers are exonerated, Samuel Adams will retry the case in the press over the course of about 6 months, writing his Vindex on the front page of the Boston Gazette, where he will essentially cast aspersions on everyone involved in the trials, except his cousin John, who, of course, had argued for the defense of the soldiers. But it adds this little lint of doubt to the question of, was this properly adjudicated, and how do we feel about soldiers in our midst? It's pretty incendiary stuff. And in addition to that, it is Adams's idea to have a Boston Massacre oration delivered every March after the massacre. And these were public performances, very, very well attended and later published. John Adams says these addresses were never read with a dry eye, but it keeps Boston's martyrdom in the front of everyone's eyes. He's not going to forget the fact that this had been an occupied town and the people of Boston had suffered at the hands of rapacious soldiers.
How did he come to understand the media so well?
In the 1740s, he is one of several contributors to a very short-lived paper called The Independent Advertiser. And it's hard there to these articles are also written pseudonymously. It's hard to really trace what his contributions entirely were there, but he's clearly very much at home on the page, very well versed in the mechanics of printing and of publishing, very aware of the power of the press. When John Adams first meets his cousin Samuel, he will be utterly struck by, as he calls it, how Adams goes every week to the offices of the Boston Gazette and contributes to the sort of purring political engine, which is John Adams's description of what takes place in that print shop. So there's very early on this understanding that the press can do something that it had not yet done in America. These are really opinionated pieces of reporting as opposed to news, and that's something of a newish invention at the time. And as I say, this army of pseudonyms it's unparalleled in colonial America.
Yeah, until we had Twitter, and then everybody got to have a pseudonym, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He would have been a pretty good tweeter, actually, now that I think about it. How, you knew we were going to get here eventually. How did the famous incident with Paul Revere and his horses happen? And by the way, those pages are probably my favorite of what I've read so far. Just incredibly wonderful descriptions of the horse moving through the night. So tell us, Paul Revere goes and chases down John Hancock and Sam Adams.
So that too was something of the genesis of the book, because in the middle of the night one night, it occurred to me that all of us are familiar with the idea that all of us know that Paul Revere gets on his horse that April night and races through the darkness. But I don't think any of us stops for a moment to wonder where exactly is he going. And he has a very specific destination. He's been dispatched by Dr. Warren to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams that troops are about to march out from Boston to arrest them and probably imprison them. I mean, they've both been Adams has been hearing for years that he's on the verge of being arrested and deported to Great Britain for trial. There was every reason for Dr. Warren to believe that that was where the troops were going that night, because the orders that are sent from London to General Gage and given to his officers were indeed to do precisely that. They were not to destroy the munitions in Concord. Anyway, so it is with that order that Paul Revere heads out that night, and he gets to the parsonage in Lexington, which is where John Hancock and Samuel Adams are spending the night, because they are poised between a provincial Congress and a continental Congress. And he tries to warn them that they must hide immediately. For whatever reason, vanity or some other, there's a lot of pushback on John Hancock's part, who wants to stay and fight. And Samuel Adams doesn't seem to be able to convince him that it's really much more important that they get out of the way. So that Paul Revere, who then heads off to warn other households and ultimately walks his way back to the parsonage, finds that the two of them are hours later still there arguing about whether or not they should leave. And Revere will shuttle them off to safety. So that in fact, when the first shots are fired at Lexington, we have Adams and Hancock nestled somewhere, hiding in a woods not too far away.
Do you think history has done that particular event proper service? Do you think we have? Do you think the myths have stayed away from that event, and do you think we fully understand? Has history been responsible with the way that event has been recorded and then reported to us in popular culture?
I think that might be one of the best instances of rhyme replacing fact. I don't think any of us will ever get Longfellow out of our heads. I think we'll always have, Paul Revere racing off in poetry rather than prose. I feel like that ride has been replaced the way the Crucible has replaced the truth about Salem witchcraft. You're always going to be fighting it. It's Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. You're never going to get past them to Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. So I just feel as if there's just a wholesale, we can just pretty much assume that the legend will prevail over the fact in this case.
How did he transition from rebel to establishment? He eventually becomes governor at quite a late age, I think in his 70s. How do we interpret that transition that he makes?
It's not an easy one. And one of the, to me, sort of interesting things about the third act of Adams's life is how little suited he does seem to established government. It really does seem as if he's better at grievance sharpening and leaping through loopholes than he is at sort of settling institutions. And he becomes Massachusetts governor only as a sort of default position in a way. He's almost a relic by the time he becomes governor. And he's put into office largely because so many people respect him and are grateful to him for what he's done, rather than, I think, because anyone had any great confidence in his role, in his ability as chief executive. One of his greatest enemies in Philadelphia in the years that he serves in Congress will say behind his back of Adams that he assumes that once the war is over and once government is settled, Adams will sink into insignificance. And that is pretty much a fair assessment of what does happen. He plays very little role. He's not a federalist, plays very little role in establishing the country and the institutions of the country.
Moral people elect moral leaders. Was he a moral leader?
I think a tremendously moral leader at all times. There's very little willingness to compromise, and there's very little there's zero appetite for any kind of ambition or any kind of selfish advantage. I mean, he really did believe that one could be a benevolent and penniless public servant, and that was precisely what he was.
It just occurred to me, what was his view of slavery?
He's very clear about slavery, and fairly early on so. He, on his second marriage, his former mother-in-law gives to the new couple a slave, which was a not exceptional wedding present at the time among Bostonians who could afford it. And Adams balks at the idea. He says this woman cannot live in their house as a slave. She must, if she's going to come to live with them, Surrey, as she was named, must be freed. And he arranges for her emancipation, and she does live with them, with the Adams, for decades. He is involved in the 1760s as well, and this we know from the papers in the New York Public Library, with several efforts at putting an end to the slave trade. Those efforts obviously amount to very little in the end. And one of the reasons that he will also hesitate to put his signature on the U.S. Constitution, on the U.S. Constitution, is because it does not include a clause outlining the slave trade, on which he insists. So his feelings are pretty clear.
There are different feelings on this question. Does a biographer need to like their subject, or should they dislike their subject, or kind of view them from a distance? How did you deal with that? Did you like Samuel Adams?
I found him to be, and continue to find him to be, immensely appealing. I mean, when I say there was a purity of manner and principle there, I really do mean it. I mean, I'm very much subscribed, after all of these years in the papers, to John Adams's description of him as this just immensely decorous, somewhat formal, high-minded man, despite the underhanded tactics. I mean, it is an interesting combination of very high-minded ideals and very sort of, underhanded wrestling, in fact. But the principles are always what's most before him, and I find that tremendously appealing. I think my sense on my general answer to your question is that and I'm not the first to say this, the biographer should like her subject, but she should never fall in love with her subject. There should be some sort of clinical distance there.
And that hasn't happened, right? We have clinical distance, right?
I think I can assure you the clinical distance. No small animals were hurt in this, and all clinical distance was observed.
All right. I can't imagine there's anybody in world history who wouldn't be happy to have a beer named after them. What would Samuel Adams say about Sam Adams, the beer?
I'd like to think I've thought about this, actually. I'd like to think he would be highly amused. It's very hard to speak for one subject. I'd like to think he would be highly amused. He was not a drinker, interestingly. I think he might have had a little bit of problem with the way he's portrayed on the label, which I would not say is necessarily an accurate portrait. But what I think would have particularly tickled him is that the reason that the beer is named for him is that the founder of the Sam Adams Brewery was under the spell of an early U.S. history teacher. And that teacher was so enamored of Sam Adams that she spoke about him a great deal in the classroom. And that's why Jim thought about him later when he went to name a beer. And I think Adams, with all of his love for and emphasis on education and public education for all, would have been extremely delighted with that story.
What is your favorite, if I may ask, and I'm not sure if you're a beer drinker, but if you are, what is your favorite kind of strand of Sam Adams?
I am a double espresso drinker.
There you go.
In any of its forms.
No, Sam. Lastly, when you go to Faneuil Hall and you see the statue to Sam Adams, what do you think about when you're there and look at the statue and look at the people walking around and people enjoying Boston Market? What thoughts enter your head?
I find it so thrilling that I've never been near that statue when there was not a crowd. Mm-hmm. And I just find it thrilling that we still, this was part of my feeling in working on these years, that we're still really burying ourselves in the magic of those years and trying very hard to channel the kind of thinking that went into what seemed like a crazy concept at the time, right? This seems like Samuel Adams's committees of correspondence could seem treacherous, but they also could seem preposterous. And the fact that these ideas ultimately triumph continues to seem to me like a small miracle.
I won't ask you if you've settled on a next project yet, but do you imagine that it will flow into, that there will be a flow from Samuel Adams to your next project as there was from Salem to Sam Adams?
There's a part of me that thinks that now I've answered that question of how did you get from Salem to Ben Franklin and Jefferson. And so in a funny way, these three books have a sort of integrity of their own. So perhaps it's time for a thoroughly novel adventure. But I, at the same time, am still largely under Adams's spell. So I would not be surprised if I lingered for a little longer in the neighborhood.
Interesting. Lingering in the Adams neighborhood.
Have I made that sound unforthcoming enough?
No. Stacy Schiff, the author of The Revolutionary Samuel Adams. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Evan.
Check out the book. Check out her website, stacyschiff.com. She's on Twitter at Stacy Schiff. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.